Ryan stood on the balcony, smoking, his mood completely ruined. He was ready to tear everything apart, just to have a moment of relief, even if only for a second. He was angry at his wife, his job, his life. He was tired of constantly struggling in the shadows. Nothing seemed to work out for him. Naturally, he couldn't see his own fault in all of this, and blamed everyone around him, hoping they would finally realize how wrong they were. The cold air hitting his lungs with each inhale now felt sharp to him, penetrating deeper every time. He took another drag, closed his eyes, and the feeling that everything would be better now made him uneasy. He reassured himself with the phrase that everything would be better, that it would get easier soon. But every time it turned out to be just empty promises that meant nothing. It seemed to him that if he deceived himself once more, he would eventually feel sick from all these empty promises, and knowing that it wouldn't lead to anything good, he would continue to toss and turn, finding no joy in his miserable job or his marriage. He looked through the window and saw his spouse moving around the kitchen, busy with something, probably setting the table so that when he entered, he would be immediately fed. Even that disgusted him now. At what point did he start feeling this way about her? Since when did he suddenly think of her in such a negative light? Just a few years ago, he thought he had a perfectly happy marriage. These thoughts made him disgusted with himself. His voice became unpleasant. It seemed to him that he was only moments away from being unable to calm himself down. When he took his final drag, it seemed to him that everything he had been doing before had no meaning. His voice sounded deep and unpleasant. He spoke to himself almost in a whisper, literally trying to convince himself. But he understood that it wouldn't do much good. And if he continued just a little longer in the life he had now, he would become completely entangled and unlikely to get out of this situation. When he entered the kitchen, she had already set the table. She had a sense of unease. Realizing that he seemed to be looking for a reason to argue with her, she now looked at him intently. He wanted to argue with her to such an extent that she would finally realize that it wouldn't lead to anything good. "You don't look well. Are you okay?" she asked, hoping that he had calmed down a bit while smoking and that they could have a normal conversation. "You look pale, not like yourself lately." "Who do I look like? Your lover?" he rudely replied, and she looked at him with bewilderment, not understanding where that came from. What nonsense. If you woke up on the wrong side of the bed, don't take it out on those around you. You know, you've been treating me horribly lately, and I've been putting up with it, even though I could have chosen not to. So, I'm asking you, let's have a civilized conversation. We all have problems in life. If you're going through a tough time right now, I'll help you as much as I can," she calmly said, hoping he would understand her, and that the conversation would be somewhat bearable, unlike their usual exchanges where they are on opposite sides, with him accusing her and her enduring his accusations. He fell silent because he realized that arguing with her was pointless and the situation was only escalating. He wanted to argue with her, he wanted to humiliate her, to feel superior. But it was as if he was in a haze. It all seemed beyond his reach. His already lousy mood suddenly worsened. He suddenly wished for her to shut up, to keep her mouth closed, so that he could have at least some moral authority over her and say whatever he pleased. "You know, I think it's high time you started losing weight. Otherwise, you'll keep walking around all chubby. No one will even look at you when I divorce you." He spat out rudely, and she looked at him in surprise, not understanding where these conversations came from and why he had decided to start the day with humiliating her. She didn't respond to him, not wanting to exacerbate the already unpleasant conflict. But she realized that talking to him was pointless, that he was simply once again trying to assert himself at her expense. But she wasn't concerned about it right now. In fact, she didn't care, at least partly because she had every right to ignore his hysterical remarks, knowing full well that he was going through a rough patch in life. Ryan had an unpleasant tendency, when he was in a bad mood, when things weren't going well in his life, he would lash out at the people closest to him. The next day, Teresa was already sitting with her friend, telling her what had happened, and how their latest conflict escalated into insults from him towards her. Her friend was clearly displeased with it. She kept scolding, saying that she should stop coddling him and that she shouldn't bother with him because he wasn't worth it at all. What makes you think that a guy has any right to humiliate you? They're all too clever. They start off affectionate and understanding, and then they become unbearable, thinking they're smarter than everyone else. I put mine in his place quickly. He became as meek as a lamb. And do you think he'll just sit and wait, tolerate the fact that you're studying, working, and achieving things, and he just looks at it and does nothing? Margarita exclaimed, still not understanding why her friend put up with such a slob. You say it as if he's jealous of me, Teresa said, puzzled, not understanding where her friend was getting at. Not as if he's actually jealous. And you think he'll just watch you succeed in life without doing anything? It doesn't work that way. Look at him. He's made entirely of envy towards you. Remember at least how he reacted to his friend's promotion, the one who supposedly has been friends with him for God knows how long. Marta said, bewildered. The vast majority of guys envy their wives if these wives are growing, improving, earning more, becoming stronger as individuals. They remain the same slobs they always were, and expecting something good from them is pointless. So, I perfectly understand why he's behaving like that. I strongly advise you not to pay any attention to it at all. If he keeps hitting you where it hurts, give him a taste of his own medicine. Marta stood up, walked over to the bar counter, grabbed a shaker from there, and mixed a couple of cocktails. She enjoyed having such a mini bar at her home. She often engaged in blending non-alcoholic cocktails, and this activity, as if soothing her, allowed her to simply enjoy the sounds and flavors. Teresa, you're old enough to learn to give people a taste of their own medicine. So don't let this jerk bully you. If he tells you that you're fat, even though your weight is normal, I would even say below average, allow yourself to tell him that he's grown a belly. Or tell him that he earns peanuts because, in the end, that's the truth. You know what surprises me the most? Men want you to take care of the kids, work like crazy, and still look stunningly beautiful. Devote 8 hours a day to yourself. At the same time, they can just look good and demand nothing from them. Marta exclaimed. Well, yes, for them, it's taken for granted now, Teresa said sadly. Marta sat back in her seat, looking dissatisfied. Her demeanor clearly showed that she didn't want to discuss this whole topic at all. But she would always be on her friend's side. She sat down, tightly squeezed her hand, and smiled at her to calm her down a bit. Marta genuinely worried about her friend, about the whole situation unfolding in her life. She wanted to reassure her, extend a helping hand, and be there for her in this difficult situation. Listen, now is not the time for a woman to endure humiliation from a man and watch him simply mock her. If you want to leave him, go ahead. Don't be afraid of anything. You earn well, you're doing great. You don't have to be with a guy to find fulfillment in this life. Got it? Marta sat softly, looking into her friend's eyes, and she smiled at her. A few days later, Teresa was walking home from work, still pondering her friend's words. The idea of divorce kept swirling in her head because lately, all she could think about was the need to get divorced. Their relationship had long since developed noticeable cracks. What benefits did she gain from this relationship? What was the advantage of him constantly being away from her? Carrying on with his mistresses, thinking she had no clue. She even felt ashamed of herself for not being able to assert herself and her own interests. It hurt her to realize that despite having an excellent education, earning well, and constantly growing, she perpetually felt unworthy of him. Marta always used to say, if you can love someone like Peter in tattered sweatpants, then why can't you love yourself? That phrase used to seem so ridiculous, so strange, but now it appeared much more interesting and meaningful to her than before. It seemed to her that this phrase, in a way, reflected her entire life, her relationship history, where she was constantly in the shadow of a man. She always believed she was unworthy of him, not deserving of him, and that she had to try very hard to stay with the person she thought she loved. When she arrived home, her husband was already there, and she was greatly surprised by this, because she didn't expect him to be home at all. After all, he was supposed to still be at work at that time. Well, where have you been wandering around? Knew I had to wait for you forever. Come on, at least heat up some food for me. I'm hungry. Sitting here, waiting for Her Majesty to come home from work, Brian said rudely, and she felt her insides churn. He was a real household invalid and couldn't do anything on his own. And she, realizing that she couldn't fix anything, felt like she was trapped in a cage, as if she had locked herself in that cage. She warmed up dinner for him, set everything on the table. But she didn't eat herself, because after his remark about her needing to lose weight, she didn't want to eat next to him at all. She thought she would eat later, that her meals would now clearly be in solitude, because eating next to her husband, with him stealing glances at her, making comments, was the last thing she wanted. We have a corporate event coming up. I'll have to take you with me. So I want you to look presentable. Not presentable in your understanding, but how guys consider it normal, he said, and she suddenly smirked, hearing his broken language. It made her uncomfortable that he didn't consider her normal. But she immediately remembered everything he had said to her. Her doubts vanished on their own. She realized that it was pointless to argue with this person, and that she shouldn't engage in a confrontation with him. He had dinner and went to the television, taking a few beer cans with him because nothing else interested him anymore. Every evening he would just lie on the couch, watching silly TV shows that typically appealed to the least intelligent housewives. He thought about how to change his life, how to fix everything now, and how tired he was. Sometimes he would simply lie there and complain. Other times he would get indignant while watching another TV program, unaware that everything shown there was most likely staged according to a script. As the time approached, she focused solely on preparing for the corporate event her husband had invited her to. She didn't want to provoke his aggression in front of other people, because if that happened, she would be consumed by shame. She would stand there, endure his humiliations, and wouldn't be able to say anything to him. "And you're going like that?" he asked, scrutinizing her critically. Now she looked at herself with doubt, unable to understand what he was unsatisfied with again. But he grimaced in such a way that she immediately realized pleasing him would be impossible. If he had decided to act this way, then so be it. She wouldn't argue or talk to him. All of that only worsened the situation. "I specifically asked you to dress appropriately," he protested. Then he went to the car, leaving her alone, staring at herself in the mirror. She had beautiful evening makeup, long hair styled in soft curls, and a short black dress that transformed her into a real statue. But he seemed to not notice any of it, as if none of it interested him. She felt a heavy burden on her, as if she couldn't handle it, and he, seeing that he was practically sabotaging her, felt superior. She understood that she couldn't persuade him, that there was nothing she could do, and he had no intention of doing anything either. She descended to the car, and he, once again scanning her from head to toe, grimaced. And she felt that familiar sting inside her, the one that repeatedly awakened within her as part of her low self-esteem. At what point did she allow him to treat her this way? At what point did she become like this, abandoning all her efforts to please him? When they arrived at the office, she was immediately met with admiring glances, and as she looked at them, she felt much better. Her mood improved, and she smiled right away, realizing that perhaps her husband was wrong. Perhaps he simply couldn't see the beauty in her that actually existed. She smiled at all these people, engaged in conversations. Both women and men complimented her. But her husband, seeing that his wife had suddenly become so popular at his workplace, felt that unpleasant sting inside him, and he immediately wanted to put her in her place. He became so angry that his face turned red. And when she saw that he was getting angry, she immediately understood that it would end either in a scandal or that he would publicly humiliate her. And neither of these options suited her at all. When he approached her, his face alternated between pale and red, and he looked like someone ready to start a fight just to assert his own interests. Any other man, if his woman was being admired, if she attracted the attention of others, would be proud to have such a wife. But her husband only wanted to seize all the attention and become the topic of discussion for everyone, depriving his wife of that right. This foolish jealousy towards his colleagues became another sign for her that perhaps he wasn't the person she should have tied her life to, and perhaps it would be better for her to divorce him. Look at her, dressed like a woman of loose morals. I asked you to dress properly, and you barely cover your private parts with that skirt. Who do you think you are? He humiliated his wife in front of colleagues, mocking her. He laughed, and a twisted smirk appeared on his face. And now, seeing that she was surrendering to him, he launched into an even more aggressive attack. You think they all admire you because you supposedly are beauty? Well, it's just condescension because they respect me. That's why they give you compliments, because they see that you are worthless completely. Everyone around froze, not because they didn't want to stand up for her, but because they had never encountered such a situation before. It was so unclear, unpleasant, and awkward that didn't even know what to do. But when suddenly the boss emerged from the crowd, he didn't even notice him. Ryan continued to humiliate his wife in front of colleagues, taking advantage of the fact that everyone was looking at him, enjoying this peculiar moment of glory. As if he didn't notice that the boss, who appeared behind him, was about to say something. Ryan, realizing that someone was standing behind him, turned around and saw his boss. Immediately, he shut his mouth, but for some reason, the foolish smirk still lingered on his face. You have a magnificent wife, beautiful, young woman. It's evident that she takes care of herself in a beautiful dress with long, slender legs and lovely dimples on her cheeks. And yet you, seeing all this, dare to humiliate her. Do you want me to tell you an old wisdom that you surely won't understand because you lack the intelligence? A woman is always a reflection of her man. If a woman is happy, it means that the man she is with is truly worthy of having her by his side, worthy of having a family. But if a woman is unhappy, then the person who's with her is not a man, because he can't even make his own woman happy, let alone anything else, said the boss, and his words shocked everyone, including her. She opened her mouth, looking at the person who, perhaps for the first time in many years, stood up for her. She became frightened at the thought that all this time she had been with her husband. He never once stood up for her. She only endured his humiliations. And never once, in all the time they were together, did he show how much he loved her. He always restrained himself from showing his emotions in public, and always pretended to despise her, mocking her. From these words, she couldn't hold back her tears, which immediately welled up in her eyes. Seeing all this, the boss, seemingly unaware of all the gazes surrounding him, took her by the hand and led her to his office. Brian, who until now had stood rooted to the spot, was trembling, because the anger inside him seemed unbearable, as if he were in a suspended state. His realization depended on this situation, although in reality, things were not as he imagined. It was all in his head that the boss respected him and was preparing to give him a promotion, but in reality, it was far from the truth. At that moment, Mr. Bill led Teresa into his office, seated her on the couch, and made her a cup of coffee. The music, which had quieted behind the doors, started playing again, and the noise resumed as everyone continued to enjoy themselves. Teresa felt gratitude towards this person, but at the same time, she felt ashamed that he had stood up for her, because no one had stood up for her before in many years. She didn't know how to repay this person for his kindness. Should she say or do something, it was unclear to her. She felt ashamed that she was crying right in front of him, because her husband always said that she had no right to cry. After all, nothing terrible had happened in her life that would warrant sitting and sobbing. Don't worry, don't think about anything. Just cry. It's necessary to cry because tears cleanse the soul, said Mr. Bill, and she looked at him with surprise, not understanding how this person could possess so many pleasant qualities. And she, seeing how many wonderful people were around her, chose her husband, condemning herself to such an existence where she was constantly humiliated, ridiculed, and not allowed to be herself. He handed her a mug of coffee and then paused for a few seconds. He simply looked at her. It was as if he was admiring her, but there was no lust or mockery in his gaze. He was sincere. The way he looked at her made her uncomfortable. She looked at him and couldn't understand. Did she really deserve such treatment? My mother was in such a relationship, my grandmother was in such a relationship, and I always looked at them and didn't understand. Why do women find themselves in such a predicament? Why can't men understand the simple truth that men and women are equal? That we are one species, at the very least, and that we are not from different planets? It's just our backward mentality. That's why men are glorified while women are humiliated, despite the fact that we are absolutely entitled to be equal, he said, looking at her with the same gaze, and she, seeing his interest, smiled. Ryan, who was still standing there in the hall, realized that no one was looking at him anymore, that his moment of glory had ended. He decided it was time to go home. If she chose to spend time with him, with his boss, so be it. And when it was completely dark outside, she could make her own way home however she wanted, because it wouldn't be his problem anymore. He was still so angry that no one paid attention to him anymore, that a vein on his forehead twitched, and he felt his eye twitching, about to start twitching, and that feeling was so unpleasant that he wanted to be as far away from everyone as possible, so that no one would notice it anymore. His spouse didn't come home that day or the following days. She never came home, which greatly surprised him. Not understanding what could have happened there, what made her suddenly decide that she didn't want to be home anymore. Every time he recalled the situation that happened in the office, he felt disgusted. Because instead of listening to him, considering his words, she went with his boss to the office and never returned home after that. When the doorbell rang, Ryan immediately jumped up and was ready to start a scandal, rushing to the corridor. But when he looked through the peephole and saw Therese's brother, he was slightly taken aback. He was afraid of this tall, sturdy man, and every time the three of them were together, him, his wife, and her brother, Ryan never dared to offend her, humiliate her, or say anything unpleasant, because he was afraid of her brother's reaction, who, it seemed to him, could send him to the other world with a single blow. "Open up, I know you're home." The man growled literally, and Ryan, hesitating for a moment, finally decided to open the door. But he was so scared, trembling so much that he only opened it after a few minutes, when he finally forced himself to calm down and gather his thoughts. "Well, pack your things. I'll take care of the bags. If you resist, I'll make you eat dirt. Be grateful that I didn't destroy you right away, as she told me how you treat her." Ryan was shaking all over. He wanted to stand up to this man, but he knew he couldn't, and in any situation, whether it was a verbal battle or a physical clash, he would lose to this man. Ryan felt how much he hated himself for his own cowardice, but he couldn't do anything about it, so he started packing his things as the man had instructed. And seeing that he immediately gave in, the man smirked, but didn't say anything else. "If she had told me earlier how you treated her, I would have come here just the same and smeared you against the wall. I wouldn't have cared about the consequences." "And you know perfectly well that I wouldn't have cared at all," he said. Ryan understood that the man was telling the truth. Once her things were packed, Therese's brother took the bags. He looked at Ryan with contempt, told him to say thank you to his still wife because she asked him not to touch him. Otherwise, there would be nothing left of him. From her brother, it was evident how angry he was and how much he wanted to simply, at least hit Ryan to put him in his place, to make him realize that he had been in the wrong. But he faithfully kept the promise he made to his sister, and Ryan at least was grateful to him for that. The divorce was behind him. Ryan, finding himself alone, realized how much he missed his spouse, how much he longed for that relationship. Despite all the mistreatment he inflicted on her, he genuinely experienced positive emotions, even some happiness. And now, being alone, he had no idea what to do with himself. He tried to find another girl, but as it turned out, other girls couldn't tolerate his attitude towards them. And as soon as he showed his true character, they kicked him to the curb. He found himself once again in total solitude, unwanted, abandoned by everyone, and disillusioned not only with women, but with life in general. Work was a complete mess. He couldn't get anything right. He couldn't handle his own responsibilities, and he expected to be fired any day now. But his boss rarely showed up at work anymore. It was practically impossible to catch him in his office. And the manager, who now handled all the affairs, paid no attention to the employees because he couldn't come to terms with his new position, and spent all his time sorting through papers and balancing accounts. The rest was not as significant to him at the moment. I want to find her, to know how she's doing. Does she want to reconcile? Ryan said to his colleague, who smirked. You humiliated her here in front of everyone. Judging by her reaction, it's not the first time. Women are like that. They endure for a long time, and once they leave, you won't find them again. No matter how many times you come back later with remorse, she won't care. So I think you're wasting your time. It's useless, you won't accomplish anything. She won't forgive you anyway, said his colleague. Want some free advice? Just leave it alone. Ryan grimaced because he hadn't asked for any free or paid advice. Unsolicited advice, which he often received, didn't suit him and only irritated him. He felt his life literally falling apart piece by piece, and losing his spouse meant losing himself as well, ending up in total solitude and complete chaos. Now he couldn't even cook for himself, and surviving on just dumplings and scrambled eggs seemed impossible. A few days later, when he had calmed down a bit, he started searching for her address, searching for her on social media. But all his attempts to find her turned out to be in vain. She seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was as if everything she used to do had become uninteresting and unimportant to her. Even her social media accounts, which he had forced her to maintain in hopes of making her popular and benefiting from it himself, were inactive, as if she had stopped using them completely. She had lost all interest in them. Ryan, have you seen your ex at all? Asked the secretary, who entered the coffee area, and looking at her, he realized that she knew something. No, I've lost touch with her. Why? Ryan asked, putting on the most indifferent expression he could muster. But he could tell that she knew he wasn't indifferent at all. Want me to spill the beans? You know what? She's messing around with our boss, the secretary said with a smile, and then wiping the smile off her face, she continued, She hit the jackpot, no doubt. You're a fool, Ryan. Literally, you brought her to his bed yourself. Now you'll regret it because women don't leave men like our boss. When Ryan heard this, he was so shocked that he completely lost his composure and didn't even know what to say. What should he do next? Should he look for her? Should he confront her about it? So many emotions overwhelmed him that he couldn't even process them individually. He felt anger towards her, towards himself. He despised her, and he hated his boss. And everything he did felt so unnatural to him, as if what he was supposed to feel towards her clearly didn't fall within that range of emotions. And when the boss finally showed up at work the next day with a stack of papers, clearly intending to delegate some responsibilities, he stormed into his office. Two colleagues who stared at him expected something unpredictable to happen. They knew that most likely a scandal was about to unfold because Ryan was burning with anger. And when he was in such a state, one could only expect confrontations from him, which always ended in either arguments with colleagues or with the boss, who somehow still tolerated his behavior for reasons unknown. So, you thought you could sneak into my wife's panties behind my back? Ryan exclaimed, outraged, without any idea of how this conversation would end. Because right now he just wanted to tear this person apart, out of jealousy, anger, and possessiveness. Because he perceived his ex-spouse not as a living person, but rather as an object, even though they were already divorced. You know what? I won't even engage in this pointless argument because I know you just want to extract some emotions from me, because otherwise, your life would simply be boring. Let me tell you something. You had a wonderful wife, an amazing woman, and instead of cherishing her, you simply humiliated her in front of everyone. You deprived her of the opportunity to feel needed, beautiful, and loved. Here's some advice for the future. When you're in other relationships later on, remember this once and for all. If a woman doesn't feel loved, if she doesn't feel beautiful next to a man, regardless of whether she undergoes any procedures or not, whether she loves herself or not, if she feels loved and beautiful, she will never leave that man because she feels his love for her. But if she's constantly humiliated, it's unknown how much time will pass, but she will still leave. And believe me, "There will always be a man for every woman who will worship her and treat her like a queen," said the boss. "So are you saying that being a doormat is in fashion these days?" Ryan retorted, crossing his arms over his chest and staring at the boss, who didn't even bat an eye at his remark. The story about doormats was invented by men who are simply too weak and incapable of making their women happy. It's easier for them to blame other men for supposedly being doormats because they can't admit their own incompetence. If you can't make your woman happy, it doesn't mean that other men who can do it are not real men. On the contrary, a person who can't make the person they love happy is not a real man, the boss declared, firmly putting his employee in his place. Teresa was sitting at home, completely unaware that her current man was defending her against her ex-husband at that very moment. She didn't even suspect that he would have Look to get involved in the mess, setting conditions and humiliating him. Perhaps, thinking that this would somehow validate himself, she was packing her things because they were about to leave soon. Teresa wanted her man to come home as soon as possible, because when he was around, unpleasant thoughts left her and she wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. It was only with Bill by her side that Teresa realized how happy she was, how much the person who was now with her truly loved her. If only she knew that she was truly deserving of all these feelings, she would have left her husband a long time ago, who did nothing to make her happy and instead destroyed her self-esteem every day so that she would always stay by his side like a tethered puppy. "I'm home," Bill's voice echoed from the hallway, and she flooded into the corridor. She immediately rushed to hug and kiss him. Pressing her close, he smiled, thinking about how fate had truly rewarded him with such a woman. He wouldn't say what her ex-husband had told him, wouldn't talk about anything, as if it didn't matter. He didn't want to spoil his mood, especially now that they were about to go on their vacation together, when she already imagined them flying away from this harsh winter to a warm sea. They would relax, lounge on the beach, and enjoy the beautiful exotic nature without thinking about work, money, or the worries of their past lives. Indeed, for her, life had truly been divided into before and after. After Bill appeared in her destiny, every morning she woke up and thanked fate for bringing him into her life. And now, with him by her side, she was ready to do anything for him. But usually it was the other way around. He did everything for her, protecting her, loving her. And she simply reveled in the fact that fate had rewarded her after so much suffering with such a wonderful man. They were happy, they loved each other, and they were getting ready for a joint vacation. At the same time, Ryan was at home alone. Sitting on the couch, holding a notorious can of cheap beer, he thought that, in reality, his boss was right, no matter how repulsive those words were to him, and no matter how much he wished that there was no truth in those words. He couldn't make her happy, and without her, his life simply lost its meaning.